if you're trying to
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Emergency Management and Community Resilience Toward Resilient Futures speaker series. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Portland State University is located in the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and other indigenous peoples of the river known as Wimal, Nichiwana, and Columbia. We are grateful to be guests on these lands. Acknowledging territory shows recognition of and respect for indigenous peoples, both past and present. Recognition and respect are essential elements of establishing healthy, reciprocal relationships and developing a sense of place. This is a critical time to emphasize that humans and the environment are inextricably connected, especially during the global COVID-19 pandemic, and while wildfires, landslides, and floods threaten health and safety here in Portland and across the US West. Indigenous relationships with their ancestral lands can help folks to recognize how human and the environment are one. Let us work together to honor their lives and ancestors, their descendants, and our own heritage. Welcome. Today, I have the pleasure of bringing you part 2 of our Toward Resilient speaker series, sponsored by the Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program, as well as the Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience at Portland State University. Together, we wanted to provide a speaker series that would showcase the faculty in our new EMCR program, as well as the ICDR mission and objectives. Our hope is that you see what PSU has to offer at this timely social and environmental point where things are transforming and changing very quickly. I'm the current director of the Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program at Portland State. I'm excited to introduce this program to everyone. This is a brand new experience offered by Portland State that has just been kicked off this month. We are offering a master's degree, a graduate certificate, and a non-degree professional certificate in emergency management and community resilience. We're one of the only programs with a focus on both emergency management and community resilience. And our goal is to teach our students both cutting-edge theoretical approaches as well as skills to engage some of the world's most pressing problems, such as the relief and recovery from the COVID pandemic, as well as the wildfires that seem to annually affect our area, and also the impending Cascadia earthquake, many of the hazards that you're going to hear about later in today's talk. Our hope is that our students graduate to be part of this emerging field, and that Portland State is in the front of this conversation about cutting edge approaches in order to engage these themes. Our master's degree consists of a 53 credit curriculum that comes from 6 different disciplines. Those disciplines include anthropology, geography, geology, communication, public administration, and urban studies and planning. Beyond that, we have more than 100 different approved graduate electives that students can take for methods and for their field specialization, as well as various community partnerships that we've created for our students to conduct a graduate level capstone to provide experience they can put on their resume so that they can enter this emerging field. Our community of faculty, which are being showcased in this speaker series, have experience from all over the world, both locally and globally. And our program gives an opportunity for students to touch on all of this global research, as well as where we're making an impact locally and making a difference in relation to the various hazards in which we face today. So for those of you that are passionate and public service minded, this might be one of the next level for you in your degree. We offer the master's, the graduate certificate, the non-degree professional certificate. You can apply for the program now, and we're making decisions by May, June 2021 for a cohort to start in fall of 2021. We will consistently keep this speaker series going, so please put this in your minds that monthly you'll have an opportunity to hear from us, our faculty, and our partners and what's going on in the cutting edge world of emergency management and community resilience. So we're excited to take this next step at Portland State and emerge at the forefront of this field with our hope of influencing both the process and fueling the next generation of practitioners that are trained by our program and are operationalizing the skill sets that they learned with us. So it's my pleasure to now be the conduit between our program and the general public. And this speaker series has been an incredible opportunity for us to showcase all the wonderful skills that we offer and give our students a little taste of what the program could potentially look like, as well as let the community know that we're on the scene and that we'd like to engage with you as well. And we have multiple ways to do it through our non-degree certificate, our graduate certificate, as well as our master's degree. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Burns as our speaker of part 2 of our speaker series, Geodisaster Resilience, Quakes, Floods, Landslides, and more. I couldn't see the little part. Dr. Burns has been teaching at the university level for more than 50 years. He's worked in Switzerland, New Zealand, Washington, Colorado, and Louisiana before becoming to PSU in 1990. He has a BS and an MS degree from Stanford and a PhD from the University of Colorado. He's an expert in geological hazards, especially landslides, earthquakes, floods, and radon. He is an engineering geologist and has registrations of RG, CEG, and LG in Oregon and Washington. He has been president of the National Association of Engineering Geologists and was the first American to be president of the International Association of Engineering Geologists and the Environment in its 54-year history. He's given keynotes on mainly geohazards in 12 different countries, and he is active in helping local news agencies learn more about local geohazards. You may have seen him on the news. You may have heard him share on the radio about his expertise. We're so lucky to have him as part of the faculty of our program. And Scott, we welcome you today to the speaker series. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Jeremy. And let's see if I can share my screen here. There we go. Let's see. So, Jeremy, can we see it? All right. Well, welcome to everybody, and thank you for tuning in today. And I'm very excited to be part of this whole group here at Portland State and what we are doing. Last 40 years of my career, I've spent most of the time in geodisaster type of work, and it's been lots of fun. And I'm still doing that. I mean, 2 days ago, I was on a landslide in Portland, helping a guy figure out how to redo this and make it more stable in the future. Yesterday, I did an interview with the newspaper about landslides, and I'm still a consultant. Portland is putting in a new water treatment plant, and I'm the slope stability specialist on that. Our final report's coming out on Friday. So I'm still involved in. And thank you to the audiences here. I was looking through some of the people who are here. We have a lot of practicing governmental workers. Wow, that's great. Hopefully you'll catch something that is good for you. And thank you to Jeremy. Jeremy is the leader of our group, doing an absolutely wonderful job. And thank you, Jeremy, for all the work and commitment that you and Leah have done in doing this. So today what I'm going to do is talk about geodisaster resilience. I'm going to focus primarily on landslides and earthquakes because we have a couple people, Heejun and Alita, are going to be talking about floods coming up later on. Masami is going to actually be focusing in on earthquakes in Japan and Tohoku. And then we also have Brianna and Lauren, who are communicators in the communication department, and they're going to be talking about communication. Communication is going to be a major part of what I am doing here today too. So here's Portland, city of roses, also the city of volcanoes. If you look, every one of those bumps that you see out there is actually a volcano. We have 35 volcanoes in the Portland area. The good news is they're all extinct, and we have 8 within the city limits. Okay, let's see. There we go. So just to show you what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to just have a brief introduction about what geodisasters are, the importance of communication of those geodisasters, and then I'm going to focus in primarily on the big one, and then landslides, and then summarize everything at the end. So what is a geodisaster? And I'm going to be teaching a class starting next year in geodisasters. And so those are the classic geodisasters: earthquakes, landslides, floods, volcanoes, and tsunamis. But then we have climate related things that also lead to floods, for instance, like hurricanes and typhoons. And then more recently, we have been seeing the wildfires, even more so, especially here in the Willamette Valley. And that is going to be a part there. And then tornadoes. We don't have too many tornadoes, typhoons, and hurricanes here in Oregon, but our students who graduate from the program may be going off to the southeast part of the United States or around the Pacific. And so they need to know about all of those. And windstorms. I still remember when I was in high school, the Columbus Day storm and the effects that it had here. So those are some of the things that we will be talking about. Now, the strategy of reducing geodisasters, that is the amount of damage, the loss of life, and the quickness for getting back to normal, we need to communicate all of the findings that scientists have. And so all of the people who are going to be emergency managers need to be in this communication area. Communicate those findings to the governmental agencies to make better building codes and land use planning. And then the other thing is to communicate those findings to the general public. Why? Because we want to increase the awareness and preparedness of everybody. We do this through television, radio, newspapers, stuff like that. And in the end, produce resilience plans, which is very important because if we do have a geodisaster or any disaster, how are we going to handle it? And people know what to be doing in those particular cases. So the communications that we send to the government, infrastructure is the key. We want to have changes in building codes and infrastructure design. The United States, for instance, every time that there is a major earthquake around the world, a subduction zone earthquake, we send a team of engineers and geologists to look at what building codes worked and what didn't work. And then we bring that back and put that into our design. Land use laws are very, very important. Where to build and where not to build. This is very important. And then probability. And a couple of speakers coming up are going to talk about risk. And when we have limited amount of funds, we have to spend our money wisely in what we are doing. And then public communications that we do, preparedness is the key. We want everybody to be ready for those things. I'm going to mention this a little bit later. And then so every emergency manager should ask the question, what are the potential disasters that we're going to be having locally? And so in my class, I'm going to be saying, okay, what are the geodisasters that you will be running into? And then what is the probability of each one of those things happening? And then as a result, we need to be getting people prepared. First of all, at home. And so food, water, home structures, and where, when, and where to evacuate. And then neighborhoods and neighborhood preparedness. And Portland is doing a great job of producing those because the first responders are going to be your neighbors, or you're going to be the first responders to them. And then one thing that I have been working on a lot is business resilience. Because if you have a major disaster like an earthquake, your business may be shut down and you may go out of business like they did in Christchurch, New Zealand, where I used to live. They had 3,500 businesses, but 2,500 never opened after the earthquake that they had in Christchurch because they weren't ready for it. They had no resilience plan there. And for instance, here in Oregon, Intel, which is making huge numbers of chips, they have an incredible business resilience plan. They said after the big one hits, they will be up and running and building chips in 3 days. So those are things, and I'm on the Red Cross board, and we have been giving seminars on how to get businesses to be more resilient. So that is what the general topic that I wanted to talk about geodisasters. Let's focus in first on earthquakes. And in order to talk about earthquakes, I got to show where we are in the world. And so here is North America. We are moving 2 centimeters a year in a westerly direction because we are being created by and pushed that way by magma coming out on the mid-Atlantic ridge. But off of the coast of Oregon, you can see the remnants of 3 tiny plates. And I'll come back to that in a second. It used to be a huge plate that was there called the Farallon plate, but it mostly has disappeared underneath North America. It has been subducted down underneath there. We are on a plate boundary. We have subduction zones. That makes us very special, but at the same time, we also have big earthquakes. And so we're going to be talking about that. So for the last 28 years or so, I've been giving talks about preparing people for the big one, the big earthquake that is going to be happening. But 5 years ago, one article that came out in the New Yorker by Catherine Schultz, who won the Pulitzer Prize for this, called The Really Big One. She said, everything west of I-5 will be toast when the big one occurs. It'll be the worst disaster in American history. 13,000 dead, 27,000 people injured. Shelter is going to be needed for over 1 million people, food and water by 2.5 million people. And so as a result, she did more for quake awareness than the 15 of us who have been doing talks up and down the coast during the previous 15 years of work. And we thank her for that. And why do we have this big earthquake? Well, the big disaster, the big one that is going to be occurring is a megathrust quake, or what we call a subduction zone quake, where 2 plates are running into one another. One goes down underneath the other, and that's what is happening here. But the problem in Oregon was we never thought of Oregon as earthquake territory. And I'll show you the map for that in a second. And so there were no real seismic building codes until 1994. So we have a lot of infrastructure that is not ready. And we have a lot of work to do, first of all, on getting infrastructure up to par, but secondly, getting everybody prepared at home and in school. So subduction zone earthquakes. The last one we had last century was the Good Friday earthquake of of 1964 up in Alaska. Anchorage got hammered, had a 9.2 magnitude that is there. And this is where you get one plate is going down underneath the other one. And instead of passing by the plate that is going underneath, it drags it down, bend, and then boing, it breaks. And it breaks for a long distance, and therefore the huge magnitude that you have got. And then we waited 40 years. The world waited 40 years for another big one. And then in 2004, the Indonesia 9.1 megathrust earthquake occurred. But then only 6 years later in Chile, we had another one. And then Japan 1 year later in Tohoku. We live on the Ring of Fire, so we have the majority of them. And so this is what we need to be prepared for. That earthquake that occurred in Indonesia, over 280,000 people were killed, and there's still another 14,000 missing. Its effect was incredible. And the tsunami was probably the major reason that you had a lot of people dead. And then the one in Chile that occurred, 7th largest earthquake since the seismograph has been invented. And Chile and Japan are the two most prepared countries in the world for earthquakes. Why? Because they have so many of them. And here is a country that is well prepared, and 800 people still died, and there was a tsunami there. And in fact, the largest earthquake ever prepared or recorded in the world occurred in 1960, just south of Santiago, and that was a 9.6. But you can see here pictures of new buildings, old buildings that were affected, lots of infrastructure that was affected, and the tsunami that went out afterwards. And then just 1 year later, we had Tohoku. And I still remember this vividly because it was about 5 minutes to 10 o'clock, and I was driving home from work at PSU, and all of a sudden the phone rang, and it was Channel 6 and said, Scott, we just had a 9.0 earthquake off of the coast of Japan. And I said, oh my God, subduction zone earthquake, massive destruction is going to be occurring there, and a tsunami's on the way. And so I spent the evening actually in Channel 8 newsroom looking at all of the images that were coming in, because it was still afternoon over there, and they had incredible images of the tsunami coming in, and its effect was incredible. Masami is going to be talking about this next week. But you can see lots of fires, lots of landslides, old buildings, new buildings were affected. But then the Fukushima nuclear power plant, the great meltdown that occurred there was incredible. Now, an interesting thing occurred was like 1 or 2 days after the earthquake, the Tohoku airport was active. And the airport was in an area with high liquefaction, but they stabilized that. I'm going to come back to that and refer to Portland coming up in just a few minutes. And so here we are in Oregon. And so off the coast, about 200 miles, we have a chain of volcanoes that is erupting periodically, creates a plate that is moving towards America 4 centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernail grows. And then down further south, you have got the Gorda plate moving also very, very fast. And then a little Explorer plate up here. It goes down underneath North America, melts, comes back to the surface as a chain of volcanoes, all the way from Mount Lassen in California up to Mount Garibaldi up in British Columbia. But when it breaks the whole way from down here all the way up to the top, it produces over a 9.0 magnitude, 4 to 5 minutes of shaking that occurs and massive destruction. And then Chris Goldfinger, a great professor down at Oregon State, has shown that the Gorda plate, the southern portion, is twice as active, about every 250 years on the average going off. Now it produces 8.0, but it still produces a very, very large earthquake, and it will affect Portland. The good news is we will have 5 minutes to respond to that. And when Shake Alert, the program that's going to be on our phones, comes out and we use it here in the Northwest, we'll have 3 to 5 minutes to get out of buildings and out of elevators and off of bridges before it happens. So here is a cross section of the Pacific Northwest with the Juan de Fuca plate or the Gorda plate coming down underneath us. So we can get earthquakes in the North American plate, earthquakes in the Gorda and the Juan de Fuca plate, and earthquakes at where the two plates are coming together. Now, this is the map in the textbook that I used in 1990 when I moved back from Louisiana. I've been teaching 8 years at Louisiana Tech down here and moved back to Portland. And you can see the yellow area is low earthquake hazard. We never thought of us as earthquake hazard. Why? Because the earthquake hazard maps were based on past earthquakes in the past. Why is Seattle red up here? Well, we'll talk about the 1949 earthquake coming up in a second. Everybody knows about California, the New Madrid earthquake zone out in the middle part of the United States, but we never thought about it. We were not prepared. But it was based on past history. Now we base things on geological deposits, and I'll show you some examples coming up in a second. And it's much different picture here, whereas the coast is just like California, and then all of Western Oregon, high incidence rate that we have got here. And so what are the hazards that we have to look at and put into our hazard maps that we have for earthquakes? First of all, ground shaking. And many of you probably have been in earthquakes. And if the buildings are not built up to code, they may fall down. The other thing is in Portland that we deal with is amplification. The thicker the sediment underneath your building, what will happen is the earthquake waves will get bigger as they come into the area. Liquefaction, secondly, and I'll talk to you about this in a second. This is where the ground turns from a solid to a liquid, and the primary characteristics of those are areas that are close to a river with lots and lots of sandy parent material. So all of the pores in between those sand particles are filled with water, and I'll show you examples of that. Landslides. If it's moved once, it has a high potential for moving again. That's why we map landslides, because if you have a large earthquake, the chance of the landslides reactivating and coming down is awful. Why do we do this? Why? Because there is no insurance for landslides. So if your house is hit by a landslide or moves down the hill on a landslide, it is not covered by insurance. And then tsunamis, in the old days we called them tidal waves. These are seismic sea waves, and we'll talk about those. So here's a building in Taiwan, knocked down just because it was an old building, not built up to code, and the shaking just broke it down. And secondly, here is liquefaction. The best pictures of liquefaction we have in the world are from New Zealand. And what happens is if you have sand below the surface that has a lot of water in it, and in this particular case in Christchurch, this is alluvial plain from the Southern Alps. What will happen is huge sand boils will come up to the surface, and lots of sand will come out. Look at this cul-de-sac burying a little car that was there. And as I mentioned before, in Portland, our airport is on liquefiable soils. And so the number one item that the Port of Portland is doing is to stabilize that runway. And you can do this geotechnically, and they're starting to do that right now. Because but when we have the big one, we want to have people flying in and out of Portland and being able to land there. And then here's a classic picture from Niigata, Japan, earthquake that occurred back in 1964. And the buildings, these apartment buildings, all stood up beautifully, well built. They just built it on liquefiable sand, and the sand underneath it turned to liquid, and it just completely tilted over. Here's a landslide. And this is not caused by earthquakes. This is caused by water. But this was a large, over 1,000 cubic yard, a million cubic yard landslide on the highway going down the Wilson River down to Tillamook, and it occurred in 1991. But the reason I show you this, every one of the roads between us and the coast is going to be closed because of earthquakes. Whether the earthquake, the big one occurs in the wintertime or the summertime, it is going to be occurring, and all these landslides will come down, and so the coast is going to have to fend for themselves, and they are preparing and working on doing that. And then tsunamis, this is what we thought would happen with tsunamis, a series of very, very large waves coming in. But then with the Indonesian earthquake, and these are actually pictures taken in Thailand, instead of having a series of very, very large waves, what happens is the flat sea, you have like a 20-foot huge wave that is coming in, as you can see here, and the people are watching as it comes into the harbor there in Thailand, and all of a sudden, whoa, that's not a good place to be as it comes in. And as a result, along our coast, we have our State Geological Survey, DOGAMI, has been mapping the areas. Every time you drop below 50 feet elevation, there's a sign that says, in case of an earthquake, go to higher ground. And then when you're in the tsunami hazard zone, there are signs, oh, this is a tsunami hazard or evacuation route. And so if you are knocked to the ground, on the Oregon coast by an earthquake, and it seems to last forever and ever, like 3 or 4 minutes. Don't wait for the authorities to say, that was the big one, get the higher ground. You have 20 minutes to get the higher ground. And so this is all on the maps along the coast. How do we know that 50 feet? Kurt Peterson and Portland State students have been mapping this for many, many years, and the highest one they had was 43 feet, and that was in back of Seaside. So earthquake history in Oregon, the seismograph was invented around 1870. And since that time, we haven't had many big ones. The biggest one in the Pacific Northwest was the one up in Olympia, 7.1. Caused a lot of destruction in Portland. Nobody dead here. Up in Olympia and Tacoma and Seattle, 14 people dead. But it affected my old high school. I went to Beaverton High School. And we used to have 3 floors. I still remember there were stairways going to nowhere. And I kept on asking, why? Well, there was a 3rd floor. It got condemned because of that earthquake in those days. I still remember the 5.1 earthquake that occurred in Portland in 1962. I was in a Boy Scout meeting out in Beaverton. We were all knocked to the ground. And then all of a sudden, this concrete floor had huge waves that were going back and forth across. The building was going back and forth. And we're all going to die. And when it stopped about 20 to 30 seconds later, we turned to the scoutmaster and said, what was that? He said, that was an earthquake. We had never heard of it. Kids had never heard of it, never in the schools. Now every kid knows what an earthquake is. And then the Scotts Mill earthquake, 5.6 spring break quake, that is what changed earthquake mapping in Oregon when that occurred, $25 million worth of damage there. But in Oregon, geologists have been mapping the fault zones that we have here, but most of them, we don't know if it's active or not. All these black lines, we just know there's a fault there, offset of geological units. In California, they got many of the earthquake faults already mapped, and then they put it into a database called the Alquist Priolo system. And if you would just log onto it down there, they will tell you what the geologists have found. They will they'll put your address in, they'll tell you every fault that is close by you. And they'll tell you when was the last time it went off, what's the maximum magnitude that you can expect, what is the recurrence interval there, and what are the setbacks. In Oregon, we don't even know if they're all active, like the Portland Hills Fault that we have here. And so so in Oregon, we can expect up to 7.2 earthquakes in the North American crust. And we used to say 6.5 for the Portland Hills Fault, but now we work by Ashley Strige and Ian Maiden, Portland State and Dogami, have found that there's an earthquake fault up on Mount Hood that goes all the way down to the Columbia Gorge. The longer it is, the bigger the magnitude, we believe 7.2. Juan de Fuca Plate out in the ocean, 7.3, and the subduction zone, 9.0. And back in the spring break quake time, 1993, the pioneer on the top of the dome at the Capitol building down in Salem got knocked off his pedestal. They closed the building down for a year. The legislators said, oh, maybe we are earthquake country. Maybe we need to do a little bit of mapping. And so they asked Dogami to do this. And so Dogami started putting together maps. And in Portland, we got 3 major faults. West Hill, the Portland Hills Fault that goes there, uplifting the West Hills, East Bank Fault, and then there is one on the other side. If you go to the other side of the Tualatin Mountains, and that is the Oldfield Fault. And here's one of the very first maps that came out. And go back to those 4 hazards that we talked about. And so the areas along the Willamette River that is here, Swan Island, and this area down here, all liquefiable soils. And then where the airport is, North Portland, red is the highest amount. And then secondly is the less higher amount. And then in the West Hills, all these red and orange places, those are all landslides that could reactivate. And then you say, whoa, look at Alameda Ridge, North Portland, best place to go. That's yellow. That's the least amount of shaking that you can have. Well, if one geological hazard doesn't get you, another does. That is the best for earthquakes, but it's the worst place for radon. Another area that I've done a lot of research in. So if one hazard doesn't get you, another will. So these Cascadia subduction zone earthquakes that we have got, we can expect a 9.0 lasting 3 to 4 to 5 minutes. The coast will drop 2 meters as North America will shoot towards Japan 10 to 30 meters. and will displace a lot of water, which will become the tsunami. And so that tsunami will occur 20 to 30 minutes later, 10, 5, 15, 20 feet high. We'll have lots of landslides, liquefaction, and shaking, and lots of aftershocks. How do we put that story together? Well, a great geologist, Brian Atwater, with the U.S. Geological Survey up in Seattle, we started walking, going up and down the coast, and he kept on seeing all these ghost forests. And he said, whoa, what killed them? Well, if you want to find out what killed them, you find wood right underneath the bark, you radiocarbon date it, and all of those forests had died about 300 years ago. And then he started finding buried soils. Like here, this is down in Netarts Bay. Here's the current soil, and you go down, there's a buried soil. That was up at the surface. You date that, they came out 300 years old. And he said, whoa, maybe that was the last one. Well, he teamed up with Kenji Satake in Japan, and he said, could you look at all the tsunami records in Japan, because Japanese are incredible record keepers, and they had all the tsunamis, and they had one on January 27th, the year 1700, they called the orphan tsunami, because they had no volcanic eruption or no earthquake in the country, but they had this huge tsunami from one end of the country to the other. And he said, that's ours. That was Cascadia. So we just celebrated the 321st anniversary just last month of this. And so we started looking for more buried soils, Kurt Peterson, Brian Atwater, et cetera. And then they basically, the recurrence interval about every 500 years. Chris Goldfinger down at Oregon State University refined this whole thing, and he's been looking at buried soils off of the coast and buried deposits from the landslides that are occurring in the canyons. And again, it's at basically every 500 years, the whole thing breaks, and then the southern margin every 250 years. So all this comes back to building codes, and we need to be prepared. And the building in the world that is guaranteed for to last in any type of earthquake in San Francisco is the Transamerica building. It's base isolated. It has the counterweights up on the top. And we need to not build more buildings like that. They're so expensive. But the other hand is to build buildings that can withstand those earthquakes. If you look at Oregon's earthquake history, we didn't even have building codes until 1974. 1988, then we started talking about subduction zone earthquakes, and we said, whoops, we better start putting the earthquakes into the seismic building code. And so we adopted 2B seismic building codes, and geologists had bumpers, to be or not to be, that is the question. And then eventually in 1994, we switched from 2B to 3. And so many of the buildings built before 1994 did not have any seismic building code in them. And so that is why we have a long way to catch up. Back in 2011, the Oregon legislature said we need to have House Resolution number 3. They said we need to have an Oregon resilience plan for the big one. They put together a huge committee. I was on it. I was not the leader in it, but we did a lot of great things, and 3 major things at the top. First of all, that we need to do to become more resilient. For instance, 90% of all of the fuel that we have, liquid fuel in the state of Oregon, is all housed in one place. That's just in Portland, on the Willamette River, on liquefiable soils, just north of the St. John's Bridge, and also south of the St. John's Bridge. And it's actually right just below the Portland Hills Fault. And so if you have the big one occurs, a lot of these are going to kind of actually maybe float out into the river, and you have an environmental disaster. In addition to the disaster is you don't have enough fuel to refuel the recovery afterwards. Secondly, many of our bridges are just not up to snuff. We've started retrofitting them as the money becomes available, starting out mainly on I-5 and then I-84, and then Highway 101 along the coast, but we still have a long way to go. And then thirdly, many of our schools are brick, unreinforced masonry, not a good idea. And so Portland Public Schools is doing a lot in this particular area there. So important takeaways about earthquakes. First of all, we encourage everybody to get earthquake insurance. It has a large deductible, but if your house is knocked off the foundation, it's toast. They just can't lift it up and put it back on. It's toast, it's bulldozed. And so today we are a lot more prepared than 1994, right after the spring break quake. Schools, fire departments, police departments, hospitals. Every June we have a day of emergency response that is out there. Emergency managers, hospital people, fire departments, et cetera, are all involved. And so we're getting there. But the infrastructure, much of the infrastructure was built before 1994. We have a long way to go there. And so we are trying to get everybody to be prepared at home, be prepared in the neighborhood, and businesses prepared. Earthquakes, we still can't predict them. Most of these other geohazards we can, but earthquakes are still out there. And now in schools, they are having earthquake drills. What are they doing wrong here? Well, they are not holding on to their desk, because if the earthquake occurs, we should duck, cover, and hold. Get under something and hold on to it, because that desk is going to be bouncing around. So that's the first 2/3 of my talk to end with. I want to talk a little bit about landslides, another one of our geohazards that we have got. And so as a geologist, when I'm in the field, I read the landscape. Mother Nature is shouting out to us. There's always a story. And what I look for are big scarps where the land has broken away and has slid down the slopes and is very, very bumpy and hummocky. That's what we call a landslide deposit. This is the most studied landslide in the Pacific Northwest. This is the Bridge of Gods landslide, or the Bonneville landslide up in Cascade Locks. Why is it the most studied landslide in the Pacific Northwest? We built the very first dam on the Columbia River, Bonneville Dam there, and you don't want to build a dam on something that may be moving. Wanna Lake right there is in a classic depression that is there, and had a lot of houses, summer cabins that are found up there too. And so that's what we look for when we go out into the countryside. Here is a landslide that occurred out in Oregon City. I'll come back to that in a second. But every year in the United States, in North America, we get 25 to 50 deaths. We had a death just a couple weeks ago when we had that huge amount of rainfall in one day. And we have over $3.5 billion in damage every year from landslides. And I mean, when I put this thing together, in July, they had earthquakes or landslides that were reactivating in New York. And then in my early career, 8 years in Louisiana, I mapped over 800 landslides. Everybody think it's just flat and bayous. No, there are a lot of landslides that are down there. So when we as a geologist go out into the field, we look at what are the factors that cause landslides. Now, number one, the triggers are either huge amounts of water or earthquakes, but also the geology will affect it. The more clay and silt that you have in the soil, the greater the chance for a landslide. As the slope angle goes up, it does too. Water in the parent material, either it's coming from outside or water from broken pipes. And then vegetation. Every time you cut down a tree, you're cutting down a natural pump that is pumping water out through evapotranspiration, number one, and number two, the root structure that is there. And then ancient landslides, way over 50% of our landslides we have in the Pacific Northwest are reactivation of old landslides. That's why we map old landslides to see where we will have a higher chance of them occurring. And then what geologists build are three types of maps. Inventory maps. Every time there's a landslide, we put it onto a map. And then what we try and do is we characterize it. What was the slope angle? What was the soil? What was the geology? What was the trigger that was there? And then with that, then we put this into GIS programs. And then we characterize each one of the landslides, and where we find similar geology, slope angles and stuff, but it may not have occurred yet, it still has a high susceptibility. And so we make susceptibility maps, high, medium, and low. And then if you add in population and density and usage and railroads and roads and things like that, and houses you make risk maps that policymakers use there. So in our state geological survey, which the governor is trying to get rid of, and which she has not succeeded, but they're now fighting for their budget. That's what they do. And so back in 1996, 3 grad students and myself had a chance to respond to over 700 landslides in the Portland area. We had a Pineapple Express. Now we call these atmospheric rivers, where we get huge amounts of water coming into the Pacific Northwest from the mid-Pacific. And it dumped 8 inches of rainfall in 4 days in Portland, and up in the Cascades and the Gorge, 35 inches of rainfall. And so with my students, we mapped over 710 landslides. Here's a map of all of the landslides. And then over half of those were in the West Hills of Portland, the Tualatin Mountains. A lot out in Oregon City, and and we learned from this the relationship between geology and topography and landslides in Portland. And it really has helped all officials in doing this. A lot of them, as I mentioned, were in the West Hills. This is up at Calvary Cemetery, just off the Skyline. They kind of have a grave situation that has developed as part of the cemetery has started moving down the hill. And in mapping, we just go around Portland, wherever we saw plastic out there, it said landslide underneath, because when you have a landslide, you want to stop the water coming into it. This guy ended up having to spend over $100,000 to repair this landslide. This one here, when we interviewed them, he said, oh yeah, we had Niagara Falls coming out of the stopped up gutter here, right here onto the slope. In the end, they had $70,000 fixed to keep their house in that particular place. The good news is we learned that gabion walls, that is basically baskets with large cobbles in them, with filter fabric in back of it and crushed rock in back, is a good way to repair a landslide like you have over here. They're well drained, they last for a long time, and they work very, very well. Out here in Oregon City, here's an example. On Holly Lane, there were 4 houses that were built on an old landslide. How do we know? Well, here is looking down, you can see this bumpy topography, but they built all of them at a break and slope. That was the old old scarp that was there. And when these old landslides moved, they moved first at the upper part and the lower part. And what it did was break right through and destroyed 4 houses that were over $800,000 houses in those days. You can see all of these houses just broken off. All the utilities were broken, the foundations, the driveways, etc. And it destroyed all of those. And other ones here, here's one also in Oregon City. The break went right through the house and out the other side. This one rotated. You can see here, $350,000 house was torn down 2 days after I took that photo. The focus on that huge rainfall event was the flooding and Vera's Wall down in Portland. But in the end, the amount of damage from landslides equaled the amount of flood damage that was there. And remember, this is in 1996 dollars. It was devastating. And so landslides can be a big one. And in our big, huge study, 52% of them were in cuts along roads and in back of houses. So you need to shore those up. And then the fill failure, where when they cut into the slope, they dump that fill over the edge of the slope. And then 9%, if people had controlled the water on their property, the runoff from driveways and patios and broken water lines and gutters and stuff like that, they would have not had a landslide. And so let me show you a classic example of landslides in the Portland area, just north of Portland, Kelso, Washington, just up I-5. They had a huge landslide that occurred in 1998, just a couple of years later. 3rd largest landslide in the United States involving houses. Over 60 houses were destroyed. Here is I-5 going through here. There's a big mountain that is here. And the area right here, that's the old landslide. When they built this huge housing development over 150 houses, they didn't recognize that there was a landslide there, and it reactivated. And so 60 houses destroyed, 77 houses up above. They said, what do we do? So infrastructure costs, $6.2 million there, $25 million in private property loans. Now, FEMA came in and said, we'll give you 3.5% interest loans to rebuild, but that was basically it. Today, those loans would be a lot less. But here's an example. The scarp that was at the very top, there was a cul-de-sac here with 4 houses around it. Where are they? They're all down here as the whole thing went down. All these houses completely destroyed. There's the main street in there, Aldercrest Banyan. In the end, everybody got 30 cents on the dollar. That was here. Dan's house right here was the very, very first house to be destroyed. And it eventually moved a quarter of a mile down the hill around the corner and did 180 degrees and broke up. And then you can see the thrust that occurred in this particular landslide here. This was the first time in U.S. history that a landslide area was declared a FEMA disaster area. And now since that time, we've had 15 to 20 areas in the United States that have been done. It was a classic one here, but it could have been prevented if they had seen, hey, this is an old landslide, don't build on it. Debris flows are another type of landslide that occur in drainages. And where you have a huge amount of rainfall falling in a very, very short period of time. In the upper headwaters, you'll have a lot of little landslides that occur, and then that sediment gets into the stream, and as it's coming down in the increased water, it will erode. And by the time it comes down, in this case, down to the Columbia River, this is Dodson in the Columbia Gorge, and this is 1996 again, it'll be 70% sediment, 30% water. This is the Royce debris flow here. Mrs. Royce was in her house preparing lunch. She looked out in the back and she saw a wall of 5-foot boulders rolling across the field. She said to her husband, we need to get out of here. The good news is it was only moving 5 miles an hour and they got out. But over the next 4 days, 4 major debris flows came down and destroyed their house. And then eventually they wanted to rebuild. And then 3 years ago, when the fires came in the gorge, this house was burned down. They never did get to move back. And then just last month, that whole valley right there, another debris flow came down and it killed a lady down here. And then Highway 84 looked like that in 1996. It looked like that just last month. And these debris flows occur all over the state of Oregon. This one, the lower one down here, Douglas County, there was a house that was right here. This was also 1996. The people were living in this house. In the middle of the night, the debris flow came down and completely wiped out the house, killed all 4 people. And this is typical of a debris flow. There's no vegetation left. The riparian zone is gone. And then the next drainage just over the hill, this is the same thing happened there. The good news is nobody was killed here. The bad news is the people came back and rebuilt on this afterwards. And not a good idea for that to happen. And so what we tell people is don't build in the floodplains, build up on the slope because of these debris flows that come down. And the press focused in on the fact that there had been clear cutting in the upper area up there. And our response is to that, all these deposits down there that have been deposited over the last 10,000 years, that was not a result of clear cutting. That was just a result of landslides and debris flows in the past, and that's a common occurrence in these particular areas. Now, clear cutting may have accentuated and speeded things up, but it's a process that normally occurs. This is the same highway I showed you earlier, the highway down to Tillamook, and you can see the debris flows that came down in those areas. The interesting thing is they repaired all these, building walls down here, put a big, huge pipe underneath it, and then took the pavement away, and then used wood chips, and just compacted wood chips, because we got a lot of those in Oregon, and paved over the top. A very, very fast way of repairing those. And so control of water is so important in controlling landslides. And so as emergency managers, we need to get people to get out there and control the water on their system, especially if they are in a high susceptibility zone for landslides. And they need to have good water removal systems that are there. And then a question we always ask when we go out there is, where did the water come from after a landslide? This here in 2005, we had a huge wall that collapsed just across Portland State. Here's some of my students in the class coming over. And the wall just blew out and crushed not only one rock, but two, not only one car, but 2 cars. Why? When this wall was built, it was built well. Lots of weep holes in it, holes for the water in back of it that is collected in back of it to escape through. But eventually, with time, those weep holes get plugged up. And they did. Hydrostatic pressure built up in back of it, just blew the wall over and destroyed those cars. Here's a house, 2008, October. Now pay attention to where the water box is here and this tree that is right here. And what happened was that house and the lady who was living in it at the time, the next day looked like this. it moved all the way down here. I was at a national meeting down in Texas. I still remember getting cell phone calls from the TV station. Scott, could you talk about the house that slid down the hill? And I said, what? I mean, houses don't slide down the hill. In October, it's the driest time of the year. Must be a broken water line. And so I was back up there the next day. Here's the water line, right? Or the water meter right there. And here's a picture that I took. Look at how wet that slope is in October. Destroyed the house down here, and major damage to the houses on either side. And so the city of Portland came out to Jim and Erica, two of my ex-students out here. They're drilling holes in the street because they wanted to find out where the water line broke. Was it on the other side of the water meter, or was it between the water line in the street and the water meter? And all this soil was dry here. And so it had broken on the other side. In the end, the people had that big sequoia tree there. They cut it down. They brought a stump grinder company in, and they pulled it across the flower beds, broke the irrigation system. The house that was down at the bottom of the hill the day before had huge amounts of water going down his driveway. Where's all this water coming from? Well, that was coming from the irrigation system. And so that's the cause there. Here's a classic one out in Lake Oswego that we studied. And a landslide occurred the night before, New Year's Eve. And the landslide came down and went through the house, out the side, out through the garage. It had 3 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. Again, another atmospheric river that had come down. Came out to take a look at it. Here's where the tiny landslide occurred here. Next picture is up on the top of the road there, and you can see came down, went right through the kitchen. Good friend of mine owned the house, and his teenage son and 2 other friends were having a party in the kitchen. The good news is nobody was critically injured, one broken a leg. But what happened was the house was destroyed. And then when I took a look at it, when I turned around from where I took this picture, this is what I saw. And another landslide had come down off of this slope up here and completely dammed up the road. And so all the stormwater that was coming down here came down. It was dammed up here, so all of it went over the edge and concentrated on the house that was down there, causing the landslide. So this landslide caused this one. Why did this landslide occur here? The reason is, look at all the trees have been cut down. A lawyer who lived in Portland wanted to keep his view. And he cut down all the trees. And when you do that, you change the whole water structure of the whole area. And you can see that the soils are fairly shallow here. And it caused the landslide to occur. So this guy down here sued the guy up above because his landslide caused the destruction of his house. And again, landslides are not covered by insurance, but it went to a jury trial, and I won't get into the things about that, but he lost. And in the end, he had his $1.5 million house had to be destroyed, cut down, and he lost everything that was there. Another one that we have been working on actually since 1992 was out in Oregon City. And so a developer wanted to develop 2 sets of apartment houses. One in this area and all over the slope here and all over the slope down here and all down here. And the geotechnical engineer who had taken a look at that said no evidence of any landslides in the past. And my students went out in 1992 at the request of some of the people living in the canyon. They said, no, this is the best example of landslides in the canyon. This is a classic slump. So the whole thing is rotated down. This is the flat surface. There's another slump that has come down. So this is where it broke away. This is where it broke away. And they actually were invited by the city council, not the city council, to present. And so the city council said, okay, if it's flat, we'll allow building on it, but not on the slopes above and below. But then what happened is in 2006, it reactivated. So I'm going to show you a picture right here because major lines, water lines and sewer lines are coming down here. And so the 2 lines broke. At any time a line breaks, and this is in January, something is moving. And so the next picture is just right over here. Oh, look at that parking lot. Things are starting to move. You can see it's right after Christmas with Christmas trees. Let's go around the corner. And oh no, let's go up above here. And you will see that the whole thing is moving away, moving to the right-hand side, and then go around the corner and look at the big, huge toe of the landslide that is reactivated And wow, the first geotechnical engineer on the site said, "Whoa, it's your stormwater. You got to control that." And they have flex tubing going down to the bottom. And then anytime that you have something like this, what do? You drill for it. You drill down in the middle, and 45 feet down, it was severed off. The inclinometer was severed off, and it showed that it was moving. It was on an old landslide. It did reactivate. And in the end, what they did is they tore down these particular areas here the following summer, and then they're doing a huge new project in the area to try and stabilize these particular ones right now. And then let's go out to Estacada. Again, when the night that we had those 3 inches of rainfall, New Year's Eve, a landslide broke away. You can see where it broke away here and came down and hit the propane tank in back of this house. It exploded. The house caught on fire. The good news is that the mother, father, and the kids got out of the house and were okay. The good news is that the house burned down. And why are you saying, why is that good news? The reason is it is covered by fire insurance. If it was just hit by a landslide, the insurance would not cover it. And then we look here, look at the vegetation. It's not Doug fir like everything else around here. They built this at the toe of an old ancient landslide. That's all deciduous trees. And then why do you have old landslides? Because these are all what we call stream deposits. This is a stream terrace here. And there are springs that are coming out when it rains an awful lot there. And then let me just take you to one last example. And that is the Street of Dreams in 2007 out in Oregon City, where every year a whole bunch of contractors will build $3 million houses. And so here is a picture of the area where they built it. Now, this is just an air photo. And can you see any landslides? No, you can't. But if we take everything away with LiDAR is a laser imaging thing that is the incredible godsend for geotechnical engineers and engineering geologists. You can see Mother Nature likes to make nice, smooth slopes, but you can see where it is bumpy, hummocky topography. That's a scarp. There's an old landslide down the Abernathy Creek, and that's where they built the Street of Dreams. And then I showed you Holly Lane earlier. Here's the landslide scarp. There is the old landslide that is there. And Oregon City has lots of landslides. You can see there's another big landslide right over there. And so Bill Burns, my student at Togami, has highlighted the old landslide areas in the work that he did for Oregon City. So let's take you down right into right here. Right down here. And so here's Abernathy Creek coming down. It's a bend in the river, so it undercuts it. And as it undercuts it, what happens? It reactivates the landslide that is over on the right-hand side. And what's up at the top? The Romeo and Juliet house, $3 million. And the whole thing has started moving down towards the Abernathy Creek. And you can tell they have a landslide problem because they got a lot of visqueen, a lot of plastic up there, and something is happening. And so let's go up and look at the parking lot. And this is a picture I think I took in the spring. And you can see it's all, I mean, the house was built in August. And already they've had to repave there. Look at the cracks here. 3 major crack systems going right through the house. In the end, there were 5 lawsuits that were out there. This house on the left-hand side never moved, but it sold like for $800,000. They said, we want out of this. And what the people did is they put in a cutoff trench over here. They put a buttress at the very, very bottom for Abernathy Creek. They still have a great house. The house on the right-hand side has been torn down, and everybody lost. Only people that do well in landslide suits are lawyers. So those are just a couple of case histories. I mean, we have so many of them here in the Pacific Northwest, and trying to alert people, about what to do for landslides. Don't build on old landslides is one thing to do. So in conclusion, in case you fell asleep earlier, what did Old Scott have to say? First of all emergency managers need to communicate about geodisasters. Everybody needs to be prepared. And you're going to be talking to the public. And then remember, landslides are not covered by insurance. And then also get them for earthquakes, get them to have earthquake insurance and be prepared at home, in the neighborhood, and then also businesses. And we need to communicate more with the media. That's why a good portion of our program here at Portland State um, uh, deals with communication. And Brianna and Lauren are going to be talking about that coming up. And then we need more communication with the governments. They need to have regulations. They're not out to restrict development. It's just to let you know that you are in an area that may be of concern. And then we need to get businesses back up and running afterwards. We need resilience plans. This is where emergency managers are very, very involved in. And it's something that is very important. So, Jeremy, that's the end of my talk. And if anybody has any questions, I'm ready to answer them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. It was a very interesting and very informative presentation. So now let us open the floor for questions. So here's the rule. You can send me your questions via chat texting function. So while you're writing your questions now, let me introduce myself. I'm Hirohito, Professor of Economics and the Chair of the Economics Department at PSU. I'm also a co-director and co-founder of the Initiatives for Community and Disaster Resilience, ICDR. ICDR is co-organizing today's event and also other speaker series with EMCR. My Professor Masami Nishishiba and I have founded ICDR in 2017. Our mission is to provide a forum where experts from the academia, the government sector, or non-profit or for-profit organizations can exchange information on and discuss emergency management, disaster preparedness, and other disaster-related topics. Since its creation, ICDR has focused on two activities. The first is to organize lecture series. We have organized many lectures inviting both local and international experts. Starting this year, we have joined EMCR, and now we jointly organize the speaker series, including today's one. The second is to organize the field trip course at PSU. The highlight of this course is to go to the Tohoku area, where a 9.1 magnitude earthquake and massive tsunamis killed about 18,000 people and destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings and communities. Professor Nishishiba and I have visited the region several times with PSU students and community members from Oregon and Portland. We have interacted with local people and survivors in Tohoku. And by the way, as Scott mentioned in the beginning, Masami and I will give a talk on the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami on March 11th, 2021, this year, which is the 10th anniversary of the tragedy. We will talk about what happened in Tohoku, what kind of policies worked and didn't work, and what are the lessons for us when we also face the risk of experiencing our own big one. Okay. So let me stop here in terms of introducing myself, and let me read your questions. Then I read the questions aloud, then I ask Scott to respond. Okay, all right. The question I see now is it true that Dogami is being defunded? Are there opportunities to engage on that as citizens or professionals?
Hiro, thank you very much. And thank you for explaining about what you and Masami are doing. You guys are doing a wonderful job. Dogami is a big deal. The governor came out with a budget, and hidden in it was not only the fact it would be funded, it was basically going to disappear. And then 7 people would be moved into 2 other agencies. Huge number of people got together and wrote letters to the Ways and Means Committee and also the Natural Resources Committee, and they were overwhelmed, and so they met with the governor, and so the governor said, no, we will not get rid of Dogami. So Dogami is there. Now what we are doing is asking for full funding, and the reason that the governor was really mad about Dogami was the fact that they kept on overshooting their budget. Well, a third of their budget had to be coming from grants, and the getting grants in the last 5 years has been very, very difficult. And as a result, they were going in the hole. So now, if you want to help write letters to your legislators, your representative and senator, and say, give them full funding. And then also the Ways and Means senators and representatives that are down there. So that's where we are there. Thank you very much for that question.
Okay, the next question is, will large dams in Oregon survive a Cascadia subduction earthquake?
And great question about the dams. And the ones that are in Western Oregon, all of them have been checked for the large ones. And especially everybody's concerned about Bonneville Dam. Once you go further east, the effects of the subduction zone are going to be reducing. The one that we're really, really concerned about is out very close to Forest Grove on the Tualatin River. And in fact, the federal agency that is dealing with earthquakes and dams is studying it right now. And in Geology department at PSU is also very, very involved in that too. And so most of the other ones, the big ones on the Columbia River, are going to be safe based on all of the models that are out there. Great question.
Okay. Dr. Burns, you have been a very capable and available advocate for bringing scientific information to journalists and news reporters. Thank you for that service to Oregon. What can we do to make sure that natural disaster science is more accurately reported upon and the public is better informed?
And so support of all of the local agencies. The good news is we've got a very, very good set of TV stations and radio stations and newspapers in the Portland area and across most of Oregon that I think do a very, very good and fair job of reporting the science that is behind it. The problems that we run into are on the internet and that are out there. But I think that we have to be we are lucky to have a group of journalists that do, I think, a very fair job of covering the science and passing it on to the population.
Okay. In Astoria, we have had shallow slides caused by tree root racking at the top of a ridge subject to high coastal winds. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes, I feel sorry for Astoria because Astoria has had so many landslides in the past and will continue to in the future. It's built on the Astoria Formation, which is not very strong. It's mostly muds that have been compacted together. And then also what the question was about was landslides related to trees blowing in the wind and then the roots being uplifted or partially tilting and therefore allowing more water to come in and causing landslides to occur. And this is a problem that will always happen when you are building on soil that is not very, very strong. If you start seeing a tree failing in those cases like that, cut it down and then replant immediately afterwards. And so each case is taken separately. And so it is problematic, but it's the geology that is there.
Okay. Assuming a 9.0 or greater Cascadia quake, how far east do we need to be concerned about shaking and large waves down the Columbia River?
So basically, once you're into the Cascades, the effects of the subduction zone earthquake are minimal. The plan in Oregon with the state Office of Emergency Management is to move Oregon's government to Bend. It's already been set up over there. And so a good friend of mine, a geology professor at University of Portland, Bob Butler, when he retired, he left Portland. He moved up to Bend. He says, I don't want to be close to Portland because of Cascadia. So once you're into the Cascades, the effects reduce significantly. Good question.
Okay. Another interesting question, who changes the building codes to enhance resiliency? How can we make this a priority?
And so the building codes are basically run by a panel, and it's mostly engineers that do all of this. And so I don't have an email address or who to write to, but if you check with any geotechnical engineer, I'm sure that they will be able to tell you who changes the building codes. Or just Google Oregon building codes, and that it will probably tell you how to get in touch with them.
Okay. All right. Where can we look up slide maps for Portland metro area?
Great question. Go to DOGAMI, Department of Geology and Mineral Industries map. And then on there, they will have links to their maps. And so they were the inventory maps, the susceptibility maps, and liquefaction maps will be on there. And so now they're only for areas where they have maps so far. So they don't have the whole state. And that's what we're hoping. That funding will continue so they can continue and map all of the state. But go to DOGAMI.
Okay. All right. Somewhat related question. Do the wildfires increase the risk of landslides due to burning vegetation? Are there ways to address the immediate risks since you cannot get old growth trees back very rapidly?
So we've been studying, and at Portland State, a group in geography, led by Andres Holtz, myself, and other people in geology, and then also down at University of Oregon have been studying the effect of fires on landslides. And so after a fire comes through an area, first of all, you will have, number one thing, erosion of the surface soils that have been occurred. And so that will affect primarily the streams. Also, especially in mountainous terrain, a lot of roots will be exposed that have been burned, and the tree, so rockfall, increased rockfall will be there. Small landslides may occur once you have the very first rainfall, but then the major problem that we have are these debris flows. But the roots are still there when the fire goes through. And for instance, in the gorge, it takes 3 to 5 years for those roots to disintegrate afterwards, and then you get the debris flows. We've already put a map out of 4 major drainages in the gorge that we can expect to have landslides, debris flows coming down. And so again, Bill Burns at DOGAMI has been working on this and producing these maps, and so they're out there. So and this past fall, we had the incredible fires, and that was a climatic thing that we've just never seen before, where we have huge amounts of fires and winds. And so increased landslides are out there, we're studying further.
All right. Scott, are you able to answer 1 or 2 more questions?
Yes, I can. 1 or 2 more. Sounds good.
Okay. All right. Is water control on your property also important to prevent liquefaction?
So for the liquefaction, remember you got to have 2 characteristics. You got to have high groundwater table, and then you need to have primarily sandy parent material. That's where it is most common. And as you go either finer grained or coarser grained sediments, then your chances of liquefaction is less. And so, but if you have sandy parent material and high groundwater table very close to the surface, you have a chance for liquefaction.
Okay, great. Well, I have some other questions, but I guess we have dealt with many, many questions. So I guess this would be it. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Hiro.
Thank you, Scott. So, okay, why don't I give it back to Jeremy?
Oh, I just want to thank you, Hiro and Masami. Thank you, Scott, for a wonderful talk. And thanks everyone for being here today. Please check out our next talk on March 11th and look for us online. This talk will be posted on the same website that you registered for this talk, and you'll receive an email within 2 weeks with the link. All right, everybody, thank you for a wonderful presentation. We look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks again. See you.
Thank you.